This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 290, entitled How to Destroy Feminism. Description. This flyer gives two broad approaches on how the masculists, and in time society as a whole, can destroy feminism, which is now indirectly wiping out whole populations due to its takeover of the divorce courts, making them so toxic for males that 2/3 of young men refuse to marry, refuse to have kids, and spend their money on themselves. These two approaches are labelled A, the Moral Taboo approach, and B, the Intellectual Demolition approach. Flyer itself. Visual centering problem. How to Destroy Feminism by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer begins with an explanation of why feminism needs to be destroyed. It's more than important that this happens, it is critical, because feminism is indirectly wiping out whole populations, hence has to be stopped. There's nothing more important to human beings than their own survival. It is this very survival of humanity that the hated feminazis are now seriously threatening. Why do I say this? Because the feminazis, the fluffy feminist hypocrites, have taken over the divorce courts and made them so toxic for men that in a string of major countries, for example the US, Japan, Germany, etc., 2/3 of young men under 35 refuse to marry, refuse to have kids, and spend their money on themselves. That is, they have gone MGTOW, men going their own way. Maybe not in terms of their political philosophy, but definitely in practice, and that is what is important. Do the math. If the current paternity rejection continues for next century, then our population will be effectively wiped out. With each generation reproducing only 1/3 of its number, then over a century, say 4 generations, then the population a century from now will be 1/3 of 1/3 of 1/3 of 1/3, which is about 1%. So the other 99% of the population has died off. That is, the population has been effectively wiped out. The feminazis will of course blame men for this catastrophe, because it is men who are rejecting paternity. But the root cause of the problem is the toxicity of the divorce courts, as caused by the hated feminazis who have taken them over and abuse them to get revenge against men, whom these fluffy feminist hypocrites see as their enemy, as cash machines to be abused and exploited in favour of women. Thus it is these hated feminazis who are the true genociders, and hence they have to be stopped, or we wipe ourselves out. The above simple logic has not yet penetrated the broadcast media. Broadcast journalists have not yet become conscious of the fact that 2/3 of young men are rejecting paternity, and hence if things do not change, our populations are doomed to die out. So, how to destroy feminism, the root cause of this enormous problem, the most important problem of our historical era, because there's nothing more important to humanity than its very survival. I see two main approaches to destroying feminism that I label A, the Moral Taboo approach, and B, the Intellectual Demolition approach. A, the Moral Taboo approach. The main idea here is to give feminism such a bad reputation that young women don't dare become feminists through fear of suffering total social rejection if they do. It's the task of the masculists to create this moral taboo by teaching society of the wickedness of the feminazis, that the fluffy feminist hypocrites have taken over the divorce courts and made them so toxic for males that the majority of young men refuse to marry and refuse to have kids, so that everyone can agree, even the less rabid of the feminists, that feminism has to be stopped. The gender laws have to be made men fair, or we wipe ourselves out. Young women need to be taught that if they state publicly in their social circle that they are feminists, then they will suffer the kiss of death in terms of getting a man. Men need to be taught by the masculists that, quote, no man wants a relationship with a misandrist, man-dumping, feminazi bitch. Such women are the first to be rejected by men. They are repulsive to men, who avoid such women like the plague. Such women are forced by men to rot on the shelf to extinction, so that their feminazi bitch genes are removed from the gene pool. The masculists need to educate society that men have a hatred of feminazis who have caused men so much misery in the divorce courts, where one father in 4 will be financially massacred and have his life ruined by these fluffy feminist hypocrites. Any woman who is stupid enough to say to her friends that she is a feminist will pay a horrible price. She will be manless, and hence loveless, sexless, babyless, poor, and spat at, utterly rejected by men and by society in general, as society wakes up to the genocidal nature of feminism and agrees with the masculists that feminism needs to be destroyed. To create this level of awareness in the general public, the masculists need to work hard in persuading the journalists and the media people that humanity's very survival is at stake, and hence the feminazis have to be destroyed. That is, the feminist beliefs need to be wiped out, discredited, and made taboo. This is one of the major tasks of the masculists. In a year from the time of writing this flyer, that's February 2018, I'll be living in Melbourne, Australia, having left China, where I've lived for the past 12 years. My masculist talents in terms of persuading the media are totally untapped because there are no autonomous organizations in China. They are not allowed by the brutal dictatorial government of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, which has killed 80 million of its own citizens under Mao, has some 1,000 Laogai, that is slave labour camps for 3 to 5 million political prisoners, no freedom of speech, no international TV in Chinese living rooms, censors the internet, etc. I'll be leaving this political shithole called China and will start living in a culture that is infested with feminism, that is Australia, one of the most feministed countries on the planet, together with countries such as Sweden, the US, Canada, Britain, etc. I'm curious to see what I'll be able to do with the Australian media, which is something so critical to getting the masculist message out to the masses. There are dozens of MGTOWs on the internet who post regular blogs on MGTOW themes, but so far there are no masculist media stars who are household names on the national media. In the early 80s, I almost single-handedly put the men's lib issue on the broadcast media map in half a dozen European countries by taking an angry masculist approach. After a decade of feminism in the 70s, the journalists were hungry to hear the point of view of the other half of the population, that is, men. I was several hundreds of times on the media, TV, radio, magazines, etc. in half a dozen countries, the UK, Holland, Belgium, France, Germany, Denmark, Australia, etc., in 4 languages, English, French, Dutch, German, which I could speak well enough to be interviewed in them. I will take the same angry masculist approach in Australia when I return, to take up the generous offer of my sister, who will buy a 1-bedroom apartment and let me live in it rent-free, after having been robbed of half my savings by my 3rd Chinese wife. Getting the masculist message out to the masses is critical if society is to take up the moral taboo against feminism. Society has to be taught of the toxicity of feminazis and the horrible cost it is having on society, namely wiping it out, so it has to be stopped. Of course, using the moral taboo approach to destroying feminism is only one approach. There are several others, for example, shooting feminazis in the street, bitch-slapping them to oblivion, taking away their right to vote, etc. These remedies may eventually be needed if the moral taboo approach fails and the population continues to fall. As the population keeps falling, the situation will be seen to be increasingly dire by the population, and more drastic measures to solve the problem will be called for. For example, shooting feminazis in the street, the ultimate genociders. But for the time being, these more drastic means can be left on the back burner while a more benign approach is tried, that is, creating a moral taboo against feminism. Society needs to be taught how toxic and hypocritical feminism is, how cowardly and illogical. Society needs to be taught by the masculists that feminists are hypocrites who want equal rights with men but reject equal obligations with men. That is, they don't bother to FIP up, that is, become FIPs, financially independent persons. By bothering to have a career-competent education at high school and college, expecting, fluffy style, to be able to parasite off the money of a man in their 30s, when their biological clock is ticking hard and they want some manslave to parasite on, to pay for her to sit on her fat parasitic ass in a middle-class house, raising her kids in his house that he pays for. Society needs to be taught by the masculists that fluffies are vermin, that is, immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin, to be wiped out. Manslavery is slavery. Slavery rouses passions. Slavery is a war issue, and the masculists are at war against the fluffies, aiming to wipe them out so that all women become FIPs, thus creating a FIP society where gender exploitation no longer exists. In a FIP society, girls are socialized by parents and educated by teachers to be FIPs, so that they have a career-competent education at high school and college, so that they can pull their own financial weight as an adult and not parasite off the money of a man. Masculists need to educate society that women are to grow up to be FIPs, to take responsibility for their own lives and not expect to parasite off the money of a man. Unfortunately, in today's world, this is far from being the case. 3/4 of young women at age 16 choose to become fluffies, that's traditional women, who expect to be able to parasite off the money of a man. By choosing to study fluffy crap majors, that is, the intellectually easy, intellectually lazy, memory-based majors such as history, languages, English literature, etc., instead of the analytical majors where you are required to think analytically, for example, math and the sciences. These 16-year-old fluffy crappers are then forced to study more fluffy crap at college because they are excluded from studying STEM fields and the professions at college because they did not study math and the sciences at high school. In their 20s, they will sex some 40 different guys before they are 30. They will then look around for some gullible manslave to parasite upon, to pay for her to stay at home to have her kids. A decade later, she will be bored with her penis number 41 and will take him to the fluffy feminist hypocrite-dominated divorce court and financially massacre him, getting sole custody of the kids, his house, to raise them in, half his possessions, child support, and often alimony, with no moral or legal obligations on her part to FIP up and get a job, which means that she can continue to parasite off her manslave after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. Most feminists know nothing about masculism, so by default are still fluffies when it comes to their attitudes and expectations towards men. That is, they see men as cash machines to be exploited by women to pay for women to have babies. Fluffy feminists are thus profound hypocrites. They want equal rights with men, but reject equal obligations with men. They want their cake and to eat it too. They want to be treated equally by the law, but to be paid for by men after a divorce, instead of standing on their own 2 feet financially, like responsible adults. Masculists have a particular hatred towards fluffy feminist hypocrites. It's bad enough that such women are fluffies and hence hated manslavers, but they're also hypocrites in being fluffy feminists with childlike attitudes towards men when it comes to standing on their own 2 financial feet. Masculists despise fluffy feminists for this and put enormous moral pressure on women to FIP up or be punished by men by not getting one. This is no idle threat because now 2/3 of young men have gone MGTOW, That is, they refuse to marry, refuse to have kids and spend their money on themselves due to the utter hypocrisy of the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts, which wreak such havoc on men's lives, one father in 4, a far worse casualty rate for men than in a major war. B. The intellectual demolition approach. Third wave feminism is a lot dumber than second wave feminism, which got off the ground in the 60s after Betty Friedan's book The Feminine Mystique came out, that complained about the purposeless lifestyle of upper middle class women in the US, bored out of their minds being housewives in the suburbs with their household gadgets and higher education. These women wanted to work and have careers like men. So in the 70s, huge numbers of women entered the workforce and became FIPs. However, there was no corresponding masculism in those days, so these women did not have their masculist consciousness raised. So by default, they kept their traditional female expectations of men, that is, seeing men as exploitable, disposable, cash machines. In the 90s, the internet came on the scene. In the 10s, the MGTOW movement got going, so that men were able to exchange negative experiences they had suffered at the hands of the feminazis in the divorce courts, becoming conscious of the hypocrisy of women when it came to giving men equal rights, particularly regarding the para, that's paternity rejection right, the most blatant example of sexual discrimination against men, given that women have a mara, maternity rejection right, commonly known as the abortion right, so the woman can reject an unwanted pregnancy, but men have no such right. If men did have such a right, that would force women to grow up and take financial responsibility for themselves, but most women don't want to do this, so fight the legislating of the para with everything they have, thus increasing the hatred level of the masculists to the level of hypocrisy of the fluffy feminists. Masculist scientist sages, that is intellectuals, can destroy the core ideas of feminism using scientifically based and rationally based arguments so that feminism as an ideology is no longer taken seriously by sage women, particularly at universities. Most feminist ideas don't make much sense and don't hold up when tested against scientific realities. Probably the greatest feminist myth concerns the infamous pay gap. In the US, women earn about 80 cents to the man's dollar. To the feminazis, this is proof of male discrimination towards women. That is, elite males are holding women down, not promoting them to positions of power and authority. In reality, however, women earn less than men for several other reasons, mostly due to women's personal choices and to women's genetic inferiorities compared to men. For example, women choose to work less hours, preferring to have a better work-life balance. Women drop out of the workforce to have kids for nearly a decade, so are less skilled and experienced in the workforce than men, so are paid less. Young childless women in their 20s actually earn more than men nowadays. Women are dumber than men by 4 IQ points on average and have a 10% lower IQ variance, so that the morons and the genii are males. So it's not surprising that men have won 99% of the science Nobel Prizes. Men have much higher testosterone levels than women, so are more aggressive, more ambitious, more driven, more persistent, finishing off difficult tasks more readily than women, who achieve far more than women, hence are more valuable to companies and so are paid more. The fact that so many feminazis keep putting the blame on men for women's lower pay, for the patriarchy, in brackets, which in fact is a consequence of male genetic superiority that women can do nothing about, that is, there will always be a glass ceiling, close brackets, merely increases masculist contempt for the iscianacy of the feminazis, that is, their ignorance of science, their inability to reason scientifically. Most feminazis are iscianate fairies, living in a fairyland, believing what they want to believe without evidence, just like religionists, and hence are not taken seriously by masculist scientist sages who sneer at such women. A lot of feminists complain that men don't take women seriously and blame men for this phenomenon. What annoys a masculist sages in this regard is that men's attitudes towards women, that is, male condescension towards women's inferior performance record, is justified. Women simply do perform less well than men across the board due to the higher male IQ, the higher male IQ variance, the higher male testosterone levels, etc. Women should be mature and scientific enough to accept that this male attitude towards women is reasonable given women's lower performance record. Women have 10% smaller brains than men, which is a lot. It's like taking an ice cream scoop out of the male brain. That is 10 billion fewer neurons in the female brain. So it's not surprising that women don't invent anything, build anything, create anything. Men utterly dominate the invention, building and creation of cultures that women merely parasite on. So the typical male condescending attitude towards women is well justified. Sure, women don't like being condescended to, but men's attitudes are justified. They fit the facts of women's inferior performance record. The masculist scientist sages need to really ram home the lack of factuality and lack of rationality of feminism to the public, ridiculing its silliness and making female sages look upon feminism as unworthy of their attention, as an ideology that is to be demolished, to be treated as disreputable, to be discarded. Once the masculine scientists have attacked the stupidities of feminism strongly, female sages will abandon their former adherence to feminism and join forces with the men to discredit feminism as well, especially in view of the fact that feminists have now become indirectly genociders and have to be stopped. Feminism will be seen by millions of women as toxic and dangerous because of its horrible effects on men, who then refuse to have relationships with women who go their own way, rejecting paternity, so that young women cannot get sperm from quality males, and hence become babyless and miserable, learning to hate the fluffy feminists for causing their own babylessness. Once feminism has been made intellectually disreputable in the minds of female sages, thanks to the efforts of masculist scientist sages, then the journalists will pick up on this attitude of the female sages and write their stories about how passé feminism is, and that it's no longer to be taken seriously because it makes so little scientific sense. The masculine scientist sages will paint feminism as largely a form of religion for women, which preaches to women what women desperately want to hear, that is, that women are as good as men, can perform at male levels, and can do anything that men can do. Of course, this is scientific nonsense. In reality, men far outperform women across the board, building everything, inventing everything, creating everything. The genii are males. Men are smarter than women and vastly outperform women. Women have only been tolerated by men up till now due to women's two traditional monopolies of vagina and womb. But starting soon, the sex bots and art wombs will be with us, so that men will be able to grow their own kids and prefer to sex their bots, and hence will ignore women in droves, preferring to not have to deal with women's negative traits such as their nagging, their irrationality, their emotionality, their hysterics. Women will then go into deep depression and existential shock, clawing at each other in competition for men's dwindling attention, who desert women in favour of their bots and art wombs. Feminism will disappear overnight in a sex bot art womb world. Women will be in desperate competition with each other to attract the attentions of a man. Women will be forced to be exceedingly nice to men, that is, to be the very opposite of a misandrist, man-dumping, hated feminazi, if she wants to attract a man's attention. There will be no feminism in a sexbot/art womb world. This will be a good thing, because feminism has to be destroyed if humanity is not to wipe itself out. Feminazis are genociders who have to be stopped. This flyer suggests that there are two main benign ways to do this, namely by creating a moral taboo against feminism so that people avoid it through fear of being socially rejected, and by demolishing feminazi beliefs by the sharp critiques of masculist scientist sages who destroy feminazi arguments. Once the female sages agree with the masculists, the rest of society will follow. The media people will be influenced by the sages, who then pass on the messages of the sages to the masses, and the masses then adopt the thinking of the sages, as has always been the case. So the masculist scientist sages have a job to do, to demolish feminism, to discredit it, to help destroy it. People no longer believe in witchcraft, voodoo, Negro slavery, etc. Such beliefs are seen as being literally incredible. Now, feminism needs to go the same way so that whole populations do not get wiped out. There is a lot at stake here. Humanity wants to survive and will have to destroy feminism to stay alive. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channels De Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, Flyers, and De Garis Essays. Patreon, patreon.com/profhugodegaris. Minds.com/profhugodegaris. Ciao.